conference workshop on correcting misinformation. I would like to ask all of you to turn on your cameras if you have logged in, because we really like to see your faces, especially when we're presenting. It makes it a much better conversation, even in this virtual environment that we currently find ourselves in. Plus, I'm sure you'll all want to be in the photos when they're shared on social media. So Secretary LaRose, my co-chair of the Elections Committee, who is also joining us, and I wanted to have this workshop focus on misinformation and disinformation, because in many ways, but all across the country as secretaries, we found, and we found this in years past as well, particularly this year, countering misinformation and disinformation was truly one of the greatest challenges to election security. And I would ask you, all of you who aren't speaking, please do mute your microphones so that we can limit any feedback that we may be hearing. Thank you. So, last year, NASS launched the Trusted Info 2020 campaign. It was a successful campaign and promoted many of the organizations represented here in the audience today. And thank you for working with us and all of our elections committee members. We found, and we knew, and we learned from each other in past workshops and past gatherings, that we as secretaries of state served as trusted voices, election administrators served as trusted voices, and going into the 2020 election cycle, we worked hard collectively and collaboratively to ensure that we were as prepared as possible for any efforts to misinform or disinform the voting public. Now, we saw many of those efforts come to fruition both before and after elections. And today we have joining us, along with myself from Michigan, Secretary LaRose from Ohio. Joining us today are the secretaries from two states who were really, along with Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, squarely in the line of fire for dealing with a lot of misinformation and disinformation, particularly after the polls closed in the November elections. So we're here today to hear from the Secretary of State of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to learn from them, to share their experiences with all of us, what worked and what didn't, as they work to both prepare and successfully protect their states and their voters from really unprecedented disinformation and misinformation campaigns. As the Secretary of State of Michigan, we also experienced some unique challenges that I will share a little bit later after Secretary Hobbs and Secretary Raffensperger. And then we'll also hear from Secretary LaRose of Ohio, who developed many innovative techniques, particularly leading into the election, to ensure that Ohio was prepared for any efforts to misinform or disinform the public and the voters in their state. So with that, Secretary LaRose, do you have any opening comments as well?
Yeah, thank you so much, Secretary Benson, and really appreciate your interest, everybody, in joining us. And our hope was that for not only our fellow secretaries of state and their staff, but also for the members of the public, the vendors, members of the press that are joining us today, that we could really help educate and share some things that our states have done proactively. And I look forward to sharing some of the things that we've done here in Ohio, and I know that that my colleagues who are also presenting this afternoon do as well. And then we're going to get to the Q&A at the end. Our hope is to leave a good full 20 minutes at the end for question and answer. So our ask is that you hold all the questions until each of the secretaries have spoken. And so with that, let's get right into it. I want to introduce Secretary Katie Hobbs, a friend to all of us, someone who really doesn't need an introduction in this group, but is for those that aren't secretaries, Katie is the Secretary of State of the great state of Arizona. She is our first presenter. And with that, Secretary Hobbs, you've got the floor.
Thanks so much, Frank and Jocelyn. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you in Arizona. I will start off by saying that when I'm so thankful for the Trusted Info 2020 campaign, my office kind of fully embraced that early on. And I will say that single-handedly, this was probably the most important piece of our effort to inform the public around elections. And because we started really providing information early and often, we had a really strong presence across social media and other platforms to for voters to go for that trusted source of information. So that was really beneficial as we headed into the election, already faced with unprecedented misinformation and really not having an inkling of what was going to come afterwards. But it was certainly extremely helpful. So, and then I will also say, we were able to get one of those controversial grants for public education, and we had some issues with, and this was purely partisan politics, with the legislature wanting to approve the public education campaign that we were planning to do, and so this grant helped us be able to do that in a much more robust way than we were already planning to do. So that was also very helpful. And because the grant gave us more money than we had actually planned for, we had a whole bunch at the end after the election to continue our efforts post-election in terms of public education and combating the rampant misinformation that was out there. So I think really, like, I have recently been referring to what we saw after the election in Arizona really as the conspiracy circus. And I say that in all seriousness, not wanting to offend anybody, but like, we saw so much false information that people were just continuing to spew, and I don't know what else to call it. And none of it was true. And I think the origin story of that conspiracy circus really is Sharpiegate. So, and every other sort of false claim that we dealt with in 9 court challenges after the election and everything else that we were dealing with really spurned from Sharpiegate. So what happened, I think, late sometime on election day, a woman came out of a polling place and posted this video making these claims that she was forced to vote with a Sharpie that invalidated her ballot, which is just like, none of that was true. There were specific reasons that poll workers were giving out Sharpie pens to vote with. One of them being that was the recommended pen by the manufacturer. But certainly any voter in a polling place, if their ballot for whatever reason is rejected by the tabulator, they have a chance to revote that ballot. And so anyway, and maybe sometimes instructions that are included with mail-in ballot, not to use permanent markers, but regardless, if there's any errors in marking the ballot, we have systems in place to correct all those. So this video was posted, and by the next morning, it was completely viral. I was going on national TV to talk about the status of our tabulation and how many ballots were left and when we thought would be done. And then I keep getting asked all these questions about markers, and I just had no idea. It was almost really blindsiding in terms of how fast and quickly that spread. And the bottom line is that nobody was forced to use any pen. In fact, as part of our public education efforts and informing voters of how to vote safely on election day, we were actually encouraging them to bring their own pens. So nobody was forced to use any pen. But I think because of these claims that the ballots were being purposely invalidated, there was this second sort of idea that the poll workers were pushing the green button on the tabulator and overriding the voters' choice in terms of their ballot being rejected or not and being able to vote a different ballot. So that was another thing. And, this issue with canceled ballots. So we had a lot, probably more than we've seen in previous years, of voters who were issued a mail-in ballot, but decided to go vote early in person. And so when that happens, the ballot by mail is canceled, and that's how the system is supposed to work, to make sure that you can't vote twice. And so then all these people were going into the ballot tracker for their mail-in ballots and saying, my ballot was canceled. Well, it was canceled because you voted in person, and that ballot tracker doesn't track in-person ballots, and it's clearly delineated on the site that that's what that is. So that spurned a whole bunch more people claiming falsely that their ballots were canceled. And then also people saying that their ballots didn't count because they would go to the ballot tracker that's supposed to track mail-in ballots, trying to find if their in-person ballot counted. Well, your in-person ballot counts because you feed it into the tabulating site. And so there was just this really unprecedented number of people saying, I need to know that my ballot counted, and utilizing these tools that weren't even meant for that purpose, and just, creating all these false claims about their ballots not counting. And I think one of the really unfortunate things is that now all these people are saying, well, there should be a way to look up your ballot and know that it was cast with all of the selections that you made. Well, we can't have that because we have secret ballots. So, and I know if we talked about changing that, people would not like that. And so I think we did learn some specific lessons in terms of moving into the next election, the specific things that might have been confusing for voters and how we can inform them better going forward, like how we label the ballot tracking websites and things like that. But so those false claims that came out of Sharpiegate led to 9 lawsuits that were all thrown out of court. And that doesn't count the lawsuit that's still going on between Maricopa County and the state Senate over the Senate basically trying to force a recount of the election by subpoena, and I think abusing their subpoena powers. They've now threatened to hold the Board of Supervisors in contempt and arrest them. So anyway, that's still ongoing. So I still don't feel like I can say we've put this election to bed, it's over, because we're still dealing with some fallout from that. So I think that really I was put in the national media spotlight in a way that I wasn't really expecting. But I think that no matter what people were saying, no matter what level of civil unrest that was happening, or the threats or harassment that I was facing, I was really consistent in calling out the lies and misinformation for what they were. And to be honest, I didn't ever really consider an alternative, because even in the face of these threats and harassment that are still continuing, actually, it's the easy response, because I'm 100% confident in the election that we conducted, actually 3 elections that we conducted in 2020, and the election results that we certified. And one of the things that we did early on, and I think this was incredibly important, we had a website that did contain all of the information for voters, Arizona.vote, and we immediately put up sort of a disinformation correction center that we modeled after CISA's rumor control website, and that was really helpful. We could point people to that to directly counter the claims that were being made. But then I just think, because I was just really frank and honest, that seemed to be refreshing to national reporters. And so I was on the news a lot. And so I think that helped to provide reassurance to just regular, normal voters that were sitting in their homes and were like, what the heck is going on? So, and I think being accessible was really a critical part of that, to help break through that noise. Obviously, we're still dealing with the disinformation. Obviously, there are some folks who I think are never going to believe anything I say, and I'm not trying to convince those people otherwise. But that's just, it's unfortunate that that is the case that we have now. And I also will say that, while I don't think any of this is funny, and I take it extremely seriously, having a sense of humor through all of it was pretty helpful. It still is. We made these Sharpies for our staff and for the Maricopa County Elections Department. They say every vote counts, Sharpiegate 2020. So I might be able to scrounge up some more if anybody wants one. And then also, somebody found this for me. It's a bottle of rum, And so we made some funny social media posts with the Kraken rum. So that was funny. And so, that helped a lot, just the humor piece of it, even though at the end of the day, I do take this all very seriously. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Secretary Hobbs. We really appreciate your input. As Secretary LaRose said, we're all four of us are going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for everyone. And so with that, Secretary Raffensperger from Georgia, thank you for joining us. And we're all, I know, very much looking forward to hearing your vantage point and your perspective on what you endured as well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Back about a year ago, our big issue was getting our new voting system in place for the presidential primary in March. We had 2 weeks of the early voting, and then we had to suspend it because of COVID-19. And then immediately we had to shift gears. But prior to that, what we had already begun was a Secure the Vote website. And we really understood coming out of the 2018 election cycle, which was very contentious between Stacey Abrams and Governor Kemp, that making sure that people had confidence in the election process was very important. So we already had stood that up. And then we entered the COVID-19 environment. And out of that, we had a very large influx, expansion in absentee ballots. Because of that, we introduced several new innovations. One was an online portal for absentee ballot requests for the June primary election that we had, which is very efficient, connected people to the Department of Driver Services, so it was secure, had a photo ID component. And then before we got started today, Ballot Tracks had a little commercial on there, and we used Ballot Tracks so people could begin to track where their absentee ballot was in the process. So that's part of confidence building. And the other thing that we did was, if you look back, I think we made national news in June during our primary with some long lines. And we stood up then a line management tool with Esri, which really gave us the line weights that we'd have average statewide. And so on election day in November, we ended up with wait times of about 3 minutes in the afternoon. So we really had defeated the issue of long lines. But what we did also see is the actual in-person voting was very low, relatively speaking, on election day. And that became problematic for President Trump. Obviously, Vice President, now President Biden, really strongly embraced the idea of absentee voting, also early voting, and had such a big advantage that it could not be overcome when you only have 1 million people show up on election day. So we were surprised. I think most of you know that I'm a Republican, still am, but the results didn't go that way for the Republican Party that day. And immediately then, what really began was a huge misinformation campaign. And I know that you've all heard about State Farm Arena, what happened there. What was really troubling and disappointing is that people had taken the video. We had 24/7 surveillance on there and sliced and diced it to portray a certain thing that happened, and that's not what happened. But unfortunately, they spoke before a state Senate meeting, and no one was allowed to challenge them. We weren't invited in to actually challenge that testimony. And then it made national media that night. I think every hour on the hour, four segments of Fox News showed that video verbatim, and no one challenged it. I was getting calls from my friends. The next day, we pulled in Channel 2, WSB, and other news outlets and totally debunked it. But you have to understand that what we're up against is my 30,000 Twitter followers, perhaps, versus 80 million that other people had. And so we began what I called the rumor whack-a-mole. As soon as we knocked one down, then another would pop up. Because we had the verifiable paper ballot, that really helped us make our case with voters, and we could conclusively prove that the election results were accurate. In state law, we put in for this election cycle that we would do a risk limit audit for a statewide race. And instead of doing a 90% risk limit or a 95% risk limit, which would have been pulling out 2.5 million of the 5 million ballots, we pulled out all 5 million and counted them. The reason we hand counted them instead of doing a scan was that people also said, because what happened in Michigan, that the votes were flipping. So we also disproved that rumor. The votes were not being flipped by our voting machines. And so we verified the count, President Trump was still short in that election. There were some deltas. Some counties had made a few mistakes, 100 votes here, 100 votes there, which is really good. We found their mistakes, rectified it, and we then continued on with a certification. After in Georgia, you certify. If you're within 0.5%, you can ask for a recount. We recounted again, this time with scanning the ballots, and we virtually got the same results all 3 times. But in that process, which is interesting, is that if you looked at what your hand recount was versus what it was with the machine count original, in one county, Ware County, a relatively small county, there was a 37 vote difference, which stick with me here, those are good with math. The difference was 0.26%. And it got put out there in media that it was a 26%. No, it wasn't 26%, it was 0.26%. And it took us several weeks before we finally went and disabused people that that was not true. There were rumors that I had a brother that worked for the Chinese, and I really feel sorry for that gentleman because there aren't a lot of Raffenspergers in the world, but no, he's not my brother. No, we're not related, at least not 5 generations ago. Somewhere along the line, I guess we are. But that line got separated a long time ago. And so that poor man, was attacked. And there was all sorts of rumors about that. Then we did a signature match audit of Cobb County because that's where we actually had an official complaint. And we pulled out 10% of the 150,000 ballots. We pulled in GBI to give us the resources. And out of those 15,118 votes, not a single vote was miscounted and didn't verify on a signature. There were 2 votes where the wife helped the husband, but it was still the husband that wanted to cast that ballot. But still, out of that, it just really proved that signature match was used. So that's what we were facing, through that entire process of time. And eventually, we continued to be consistent. Every day, we were doing a press conference, and we were going out there. I would say a short piece, and then we brought in Gabriel Sterling, our implementation manager. And obviously, he's the one that made that famous speech about someone was going to be hurt. Little do we know that it would actually be a protester that would end up losing their life along with 5 other people on January 6th. On January 6th, I wrote a 10-page letter, and this is it. And I sent it to our congressmen and told them about why they should not be objecting to the electoral vote count. And I went through a point-by-point rebuttal of everything that had been stated by President Trump's supporters and allegations. We wanted it to be ready to be part of the congressional record. And so I continue to send out PDFs. It's on our Secretary of State webpage so that people can access that if they really would like to make an informed decision. I understand that Republicans are disappointed. I get that. But at the end of the day, we had a fair and honest election, and we were true to the Constitution, and we're true to law. And the results that were reported are the accurate results that President Biden did carry the state of Georgia by about 11,000 some odd votes. So that's a brief story of where we were. It wasn't a lot of fun. And I don't think any state that was in contention like we were, obviously the speakers we have today. I'm glad that you had fun with your Kraken, wine or rum. That is a great way to maybe have some laughter about it. But when you're in the middle of the maelstrom, it wasn't a lot of fun. But you have to stand, true for the process, the Constitution, and sometimes you have to have the courage just to stand up to your own party. So there's what we did, and those are the results. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Secretary Raffensperger. I know we all appreciate your commitment to the rule of law and your dedication to the truth and to the oath of office you took. And so thank you for joining us here today and your willingness to share your experiences from your vantage point, your perspective, as so many of us witnessed it and witnessed your leadership and your grace under fire throughout the country, both you and Secretary Hobbs. And now as we turn to Michigan, I'll start. I just want to say 3 things. There's 3 aspects of my remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Secretary LaRose to share his experiences in Ohio. In Michigan, we had really, as in all the states in the country, nearly, one of the most successful, well-run and secure elections in our history. And so, we initially had this bifurcation. Now, as we do a look back, of the real experience, and then the perceptions that were generated to serve political and partisan goals, but weren't really based on any actual evidence or reality of what was happening in our state, which is also, again, the heart of misinformation and disinformation. So I want to talk about first pre-election, pre-November election, and our work there, post-election, which took a different turn, and then looking forward, where do we go from here? So sort of pre-election and in reflection on that, the reality is, and the baseline, the foundation for everything in our state was that, Michigan had more people vote on both sides of the aisle than ever before. 5.5 million citizens voted, and that was on the heels of our largest turnout primary election in August, where 2.5 million people voted. That was more than had ever voted in an August election. So we actually were a great success story. We also saw more than 30,000 people registering and voting on election day itself, all eligible, all participating, particularly young voters, and a record-shattering 3.3 million citizens voted absentee in November. That was 3 times the number of people who had voted absentee in the prior presidential fall election in November 2016. Voters were able to vote absentee and register through election day based on a voter-driven reform, a constitutional amendment that voters voted in overwhelmingly in 2018. So we already also had a baseline of buy-in from our voters, all voters, on these new voter conveniences that were in place. And then we were also facing the challenge that because our legislature did not update our statutes to match these new constitutional amendments that voters voted in, expanding absentee ballot voting in Michigan. As many of you know, our legislature did not provide any time prior to election day for absentee ballot processing. The clerks and election workers had to prepare to go at 7 a.m. on election day with processing and tabulating the ballots. There was some 10 hours that was given to our largest communities prior to election day, just that Monday, to enable some pre-processing. It helped a little bit, but really didn't have a significant impact. But on the other end, we had calculated based on past elections that it would take about 80 hours or take us through Friday to tabulate all of the 3.3 million absentee ballots we were anticipating receiving, knowing that no one could open them until election day morning. What I'm particularly proud about, and this is another success story of Michigan, is that we actually cut that time in half, had the full unofficial results done by 24 hours after the polls closed Wednesday night. And that also positioned Michigan nationally, because we knew the spotlight would be on us, to demonstrate that we were able to get things done efficiently, basically by increasing the number of election workers and machines that we had in place. And that decision and that success actually became very notable and critical, because we had set the expectation that it would take until Friday, based on math, to count all these absentee ballots. And so our unofficial results would be expected on Friday. When we were able to deliver them, those unofficial results, on Wednesday, we actually, I think, caught some people off guard who began a lot of problems, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, Wednesday night, that then sort of went through Thursday and Friday. It almost sort of seemed that there was a coordinated effort, assuming there wouldn't be results available yet, to try to slow down the tabulation process on Thursday and Friday. You actually saw that play out in Arizona and Pennsylvania. We didn't have that in Michigan because we surprised everyone, more or less, with our efficiency and finished sooner than everyone anticipated, thus cutting the time in which people could deliver or create a misinformation campaign successfully during the tabulation process, which we were anticipating. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but when you're talking about the foundation for success in Michigan, that was a key part of the post-election response. Pre-election, I'll just say really briefly, is prior to the election, we did see both general and targeted misinformation campaigns across our state. They were targeted particularly in two ways. One, to sow seeds of doubt about the sanctity of the absentee voting process. And secondly, there was targeting specifically in communities of color, particularly in Detroit and Flint, where we learned of robocalls that were targeting voters of color, specifically causing or seeking to cause uncertainty about whether to vote absentee. So I think the name of our success, the heart of our success, was really anticipation and education and empowerment. And pre-election, that anticipation of essentially that there would be a misinformation campaign designed in the way I just mentioned, sort of gave way to education and empowerment, where our goal was essentially to educate voters about what was true and what their rights were to vote absentee and how to do it and the sanctity of the process, and then to empower them to respond to misinformation by reporting it to us. And we maintained a fact-checking website throughout the pre-election process, throughout the election cycle, where voters could report misinformation to us and would post it, debunk it, and post it online and then spread the word about it. So what actually then happened, particularly close to election day, when we got word of robocalls targeting voters that said, if you vote absentee, these terrible things will happen to you. They reported it to us quickly. And by us, I mean the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. And we then were able to quickly respond and debunk it. And frankly, for the Attorney General standpoint, investigate and hold accountable any who were found in violation of the law. And so that actually was very, in my view, critical, but also a mark of success that we anticipated ahead of time in the spring of 2020. The misinformation or the substance of the misinformation, we began proactive, which would be to target absentee voting. We saw this already coming from the White House and other places. We then began a education campaign that, among other things, involved us mailing absentee ballot applications to every registered voter so that they would know how to request an absentee ballot. They would know what to do with that absentee ballot once they received it, returning it through the mail or at a local drop box. And we basically planted seeds of proactive education throughout the summer so that in the fall, when that misinformation escalated, voters knew what to do. They knew what was right. They already knew and believed in the absentee voting process. And how do we know that it worked? Well, not only because when misinformation hit, it was reported to us and debunked very quickly, but secondly, 3.3 million people voted absentee, more than ever before. And so we saw, even in communities of color, even in targeted communities, people still voted absentee. They still believed in that process. And that was due in part to our education efforts preceding the misinformation that we anticipated. And so in my view, that was really significant. Once we saw that we had really sort of crested that wave prior to the election, that people were voting absentee, they believed in the process, they knew where to find the drop boxes, they knew where the satellite offices were to request their ballots. We saw all that data coming in, and we saw the reports of misinformation also coming in, so we were able to debunk it, we were able to get it removed, taken down. After robocalls, we got them stopped. So I felt very good about our effort there. And then that also enabled us to anticipate and focus beginning in about October on the area, and I know my time's running out, so I'll finish quickly, but in the area between the polls closing and the election results being announced. We knew that window, which we publicly talked about as being from Tuesday to Friday, the moment from the polls closing till we have our election results available. That window was going to be utilized by bad actors to try to sow seeds of doubt as well about the sanctity of our elections. So we anticipated that. We increased the efficiency of our counting process so that window would be as short as possible, and we did that successfully. And then in doing so, we had the misinformation and a number of other things in place to ensure that we were able to respond to misinformation that came in. The last thing I'll say, however, is what we didn't anticipate, which was the dramatic increase in the vitriol and the volume of misinformation after the announcement came on CNN at 4:30 on Wednesday, after the polls closed, of who was leading and who had potentially won Michigan from a presidential standpoint in those unofficial results. And so that is when we saw the same egregious conspiracy theories that my colleagues in Arizona and Georgia have already talked about percolate, grow, and that's when the post-election battle began. Now, we can talk during Q&A about that effort, but I think the bottom line for us is that we stayed ahead of this information. We corrected every bit of it in press and social media. We compiled a website of fact checking. And in addition to all that, I think all three of us who've spoken already embraced our role as national leaders of being a voice of calm and reason and truth tellers to counter the misinformation that was escalating and the impact it had on really terrifying voters. We've reminded them that democracy is strong. It has numerous checks and balances in place to ensure it prevails. And then this past week, we proposed a series of changes, increasing security protocols for our voting machines, moving up the audit process so that it happens earlier, providing training for election challengers so that when they are observing an election counting process, they know what they're seeing and they don't misinterpret things to create nefarious rumors. So we are also now looking forward, proposing legislative changes to help address a lot of the sources of the misinformation, and in that way ensure that we don't see a repeat of this type of post-election challenges or shenanigans, as I've been calling them, percolate or expand in the years ahead. So thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Benson. Did you win a bet by including the word shenanigans in your remarks?
No, but a lot of it's like become this controversial thing. They don't like that I got, but anyway.
Okay. Well, hey, I appreciate your thoughts. I look forward to sharing really a few concrete examples of things that we did in Ohio, mostly leading up to the election, to combat and to inoculate against disinformation and misinformation. I may use those two terms interchangeably, but we understand obviously that they mean different things. But also want to start off by saying that the result of our work showed in that we had, like Jocelyn Benson, like Secretary Benson mentioned, the most successful election that we'd ever had in Ohio. As she said, Michigan had, and it's not hyperbole to say, at least as it relates to what we saw in Ohio, that it was the most successful election we've ever seen, and in the midst of the most challenging circumstances we've ever seen. Again, not hyperbole there. In fact, our friend, I don't know if he's with us today, but our friend Trey Grayson, former Kentucky Secretary of State, wrote a column for The Economist where he talked about the 2020 election as the stress test, kind of the worst case scenario if you were to sit down and come up with all of the most challenging things you could throw at elections administrators. It would look a lot like what we saw in 2020. But in the midst of that, in Ohio, we had record participation, 6 million votes cast, almost 6 million votes cast, record participation as a rate, a percentage with close to 75%. But at the same time, we had record return rate on people returning their absentee ballots. I believe it was 94%. We've never seen a number that high. We had record low in ballot rejection because of voter mistakes. That's normally hovers around 1%. We had that number cut down to 0.42%. Record numbers of poll workers with 56,000 Ohioans out to work the polls on Election Day, and record early and absentee voting with 59% of our votes cast before the polls ever opened on Election Day. Normally that number in Ohio hovers in the 35% range. And so really remarkable things. But again, combating disinformation was a big part of that, because one of the most important jobs that we have as secretaries of state is making sure that the voters of our state can go confidently to the polls, whether they do early voting or voting absentee or whether they go to the polls on Election Day. They should be able to go confidently to the polls knowing that their voice will be heard in a fair and an honest contest. And so that's why I really tackled disinformation as something that was a top priority for me from the beginning of my administration 2 years ago. Some of you may have seen, I was quoted in a national newspaper a couple months ago talking about the real mythology that exists around elections administration. It is fertile ground for creative imaginations. I don't need to tell you all that, but people make up a lot of things that just aren't so about elections administration, and it's unfortunate, but it's human nature, I suppose. And so it's something that we all need to accept as a challenge as secretaries of state to combat that kind of mythology with accurate information. And where it, of course, is even more pernicious is when it's intentional. That's that disinformation. And so to start, when I started working on this issue, both for my staff, our boards of elections, and for our partners throughout the state, the other stakeholders, I started by defining the issue. First of all, misinformation and disinformation, one being intentional and the other being just sort of urban legend and rumor, but also just sort of understanding what these are, because those terminologies that we use can be a little arcane for some people. This is what in a previous generation we would have just called propaganda. And from my time in the military, we had words for it like information operations or psychological warfare. But propaganda is a pretty accessible word that most people understand. It's intentional spread of false information with a tactical purpose, a specific purpose in mind. And in this case, the purpose is generally to confuse and disorient voters and to get them to choose to disenfranchise themselves by not participating. And so that's something that's ugly and can never be tolerated in any of its forms. And so I want to talk about two examples where we proactively, there were many, but where we proactively addressed an issue and sort of whacked it down, that whack-a-mole idea that Brad talked about, which is necessary. One was an example where we saw a video making its rounds on social media showing an envelope. It ended up was an envelope from the Florida primary, not from the general election, but it indicated party indication on the ballot envelope. Many of you may have seen this. And a lot of Ohioans were concerned, saying, well, if my return envelope has my party affiliation on it, the postal carrier could throw it away if they don't like my party or what have you. And so I was very intentional about that on social media by recording a video and putting it out there and then working with our traditional media partners to help it saturate that much more. Another example was there was a individual, may not have even been an Ohioan, may have been a foreign, who knows, but there was an individual that claimed that he worked in a mailroom at a residence hall at Ohio State University, and that he was throwing away ballots that belonged, absentee ballots that belonged to people from a party that he disagreed with. We, within hours of that, had already gotten on the phone with Ohio State University and worked with them, had gotten on the phone with law enforcement and had recorded a video. And I was very direct that we had absolutely no evidence to show that that was happening. But if it was, I told this person, this is not a prank. It's not cute. It's a felony that you're committing. And so we were very, again, purposeful about addressing that. One last example, and this happened in the primary. We saw an individual, and because of our social media tracking that we set up a very sophisticated operations center where we had staff members monitoring social media around the clock, because we believed that was going to be the canary in the coal mine. That was going to be the first indication of some sort of misinformation or disinformation, and often it was. There was an individual going around to polling locations. He had gone to his polling location and cast a ballot, and then he was going to other polling locations and claiming that he was a voter that wanted to vote. Now, like in many of your states in Ohio, in that scenario, he's given a provisional ballot. It's resolved after the fact. None of those provisional ballots would have been counted because that individual was not a registered voter in that precinct. But he had his camera out and he was filming himself saying, here, I'm going into another polling location. They're going to give me another ballot. He was claiming that he was being allowed to vote multiple times. Well, with a little bit of research, we were able to get this individual on the phone within 20 minutes of this popping up and tell him, hey, you may try to make yourself famous like this on social media, but what you're doing is against the law and you may be held criminally liable for it. He stopped his activity, thankfully, because we were able to track that down and sort of stop that before it grew. But as much as sort of the whack-a-mole of going after specific instances like that is important, what we found to be even more effective is the proactive, what I call the inoculation, to prepare a population to be resilient against that kind of disinformation. And I want to share just two quick examples of that. One, we started doing training around the state for members of the media. Now, I'll be candid, my staff thought this was a bad idea when I first brought it up. They thought that nobody's going to show up. These reporters are all too busy. They don't want to be talked to or sort of educated about elections. They just want to do their work. But what I believed was, and what proved true, is that the people I know in journalism are very dedicated to their work and they care about getting the story right. But most of them are not elections experts. They've never worked at a board of elections. Many of them never even been behind the counter of a board of elections. And so there was a learning curve that they needed to learn to be prepared to be a better reporter on elections issues. And so we started doing Elections 101 training at boards of elections and inviting the press. And the first time we did it, there was an absolute huge turnout. We invited people to pack a lunch. And we did a briefing, and then we did a tour of the Board of Elections. We also helped them to understand disinformation because, as we all have seen in some of the briefings that we get and that kind of thing, unfortunately, reporters can also be targets of disinformation. When a disinformation actor wants to get his false narrative to cross over into credentialed journalism. And so we thought that it was important for members of the Ohio Press Corps to understand elections administration and understand what disinformation looked like. Another one, and then those, of course, became virtual once the pandemic began, but we continued to do those. One other one that I really focused on was Ohio's minority community. We saw, I think, one of the most pernicious, really ugly forms of disinformation was when it was targeted at the minority community, and it was very clear what the objective was to inflame existing distrust, to inflame existing tension to cause people to choose not to vote. As Secretary Benson mentioned, we have a criminal prosecution underway that occurred. The crime occurred both in Michigan and in Ohio, where a very ugly auto dial or robocall went out that was meant to dissuade minority voters from participating in absentee voting. And again, because of our work together, not only in Ohio, but in Michigan, those individuals are going to face justice for the crime that they committed. But we started doing minority disinformation sessions where we brought together clergy members of the NAACP, members of the Urban League, and many others, and offered a slide presentation on how to recognize disinformation, what it is, and how to combat it. Because honestly, the best antidote to a lie is the truth, and lots of it. And it's better when that truth can come from a trusted community partner, like a minister, like an NAACP or Urban League leader, for example. And so we were able to really partner with them, not only to push back when there was false information out there, but also to kind of deputize them to be a source of reporting that to us. And in fact, in that example of that really ugly robocall that went out in both Michigan and in Ohio, our phones started ringing and our emails started alerting within minutes of that call going out, because we had built those partnerships in the minority community that knew what they were hearing was wrong, and they reported it to us. And as a result, we were able to take swift action. Really proud of the work that we were able to do, but we can't rest on that. I think we all have to continue working on this. Civic education matters. Helping people understand elections administration at a deeper level matters. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we have right now, because people are interested in this work that we do as elections administrators, is to educate the public. Because once people understand elections, a lot of this mythology starts to melt away when people realize that these fantasies they have in their head are just simply not possible. So I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I look forward to the questions that we have. Secretary Benson?
Thank you, Secretary LaRose, and thank you all for all of our presenters for sharing your experiences in this very challenging cycle. I see, so please, secretaries and staff, the questions are open to you in our final 15 or so minutes here, and we have Secretary Toulouse Oliver from New Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you, Secretary Benson and Secretary LaRose, and really all of you for breaking down the challenges that you all went through. I know some of us went through some greater challenges than others, and certainly a few of you had some of the worst to deal with. And so my hat's off to all of you. Jocelyn, forgive me if I'm asking something you already addressed to a greater degree than I am remembering right now, but I wanted to ask, do you have any specific thoughts or anything that you can share with us about, the whole Dominion fiasco and kind of how that started and where you see it going?
Yeah, thanks, Secretary Toulouse Oliver. And I think both Secretary Raffensperger and I, and also, in particular, the two of us in Michigan and Georgia saw the brunt of it. And what we saw was how there was really a concerted effort to find any particular nuance or wrinkle in a system and exploit it to further a political or partisan agenda. And we also saw how the courts could potentially be abused, and in some ways still are. The court process still is in some ways being abused as a tool to create a platform to further misinformation. And I think on the other end of it, you now see Dominion really strongly pushing back and fighting back, using the legal system as well to move forward, because the truth is on their side in protecting the integrity of their brand name as well. And so I think, as Secretary Raffensperger was talking about, in Michigan, we have paper ballots. And so as we move forward, knowing that there was really escalating, really even surprisingly escalating efforts to just lie to the public about the sanctity and the accuracy of voting machines. We knew we had two things in place that could ultimately have worked to debunk that in Michigan. One is our paper ballot system, so you always have a paper record of the vote. And two is our robust post-election audit system. And in fact, here in Michigan, we have, in the post-election cycle, implemented the most robust post-election audits, both at the local level and our statewide risk limiting audit that is going on right now. Happening, and so that is also affirming the accuracy of the voting machines. We also, in Antrim County in particular, because that became a sort of nexus of a lot of the rumors, we did a full 100% audit proactively of all of the paper ballots to again affirm, as it did, and we actually live streamed it so that everyone could watch it. And that also affirmed, through the use of paper ballots and the audit of those ballots, that the machines accurately did tabulate every single one of, or tabulate those ballots for the results that were included in the official results. So we continue to respond and utilize the tools at our disposal to address any type of misinformation about the voting machines. And then we also know that part of our challenge in Michigan was twofold. One, a candidate can request a recount if they also would like to affirm that machines accurately tabulated ballots. Candidates didn't do that, particularly the candidates at the presidential level, whose supporters were spreading these rumors. They actually had a very easy fix if they actually did feel that these machines didn't tabulate their ballots correctly, which was ask for a recount, as they did in Georgia. They didn't do that in Michigan. And so we move forward with our post-election audit process, which has that similar affirmation of the accuracy of the tabulation. But it was a little bit notable, for us at least, that no recount was requested that would have then combated any type of accurate concerns. And the last thing I'll say, what we also found to be a challenge was under Michigan law, we are unable to access the materials needed to do a post-election audit until after the certification. And in Michigan, after the polls close, you have the unofficial tabulation, you have the canvassing at the local level, which happens county by county, which is really like the first audit. Then you have the certification, and then after that, any post-election audits can begin. So there was a moment, a space that nefarious bad actors were able to use before we could begin the audits, because that certification had to happen first under our law. And that space was also misused, that time, that the news coverage, the use of the legal system to create platforms to further misinformation. That was really used to a great extent to further these rumors before we could go through the audit process that again affirmatively debunked them. So it was that's one of the things we want to change moving forward. We want to begin the auditing process prior to certification. We need a lot of change in order to do that. But we really did see how this sort of effort can percolate, and great to see Dominion now fighting back to ensure that their name and that the truth continues to be affirmed. We also see Secretary Merrill, and I think I saw Kyle, Secretary Ardoin as well. I think you had your hand raised, but we'll go to Secretary Merrill next.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Secretary Benson. I am finding this really interesting, particularly for two reasons. One is that it strikes me how similar all of our processes are. And, I'm finding great benefit in what Secretary Benson just said about what are those places where things kind of were able to be broken down by others. And I'm also, thank you so much, Secretary LaRose, for the discussion about how we combat misinformation with truth, and more truth. And that's exactly right. So it reminds me of the fact that we used to have here at NASS a committee on voter education. I forget what we called it exactly. We folded it into the elections committee, but I'm wondering if we, might have a discussion maybe in the secretary's only meeting about reconstituting that in some way, because I, for one, would love to see maybe a report from various secretaries about recommendations they might make. NASS has done that occasionally, had written about, what kinds of things the rest of us could learn about what we're currently doing, what made the most difference when it came to this vast store of misinformation, and all of us in one way or another were combating this during this last election. No one more than the four of you, of course, but it was going on everywhere. So I just want to throw that out as an idea. I wonder what your reaction would be to that. I don't know how we could focus it, but I, for one, think it would be very useful for all of us. So for anybody.
Or Brad, I'm interested in your thoughts. I know Frank and I can share ours. We certainly support that. I want to have more conversations on that in the future, but interested in your thoughts and how proactive voter education could have assisted your efforts in Arizona and Georgia this year.
Sure. I think we did engage in a lot of proactive voter education. I think we definitely learned some lessons post-election about additions we could make to that pre-election voter education. I think that, again, was the information we put out leading up to the election was really so important. And then post-election, we were able to put together a couple of brief videos that talked about the processes that were taking place to help demystify it. And certainly we have those tools available now that we can put out ahead of the election next time. I think that will be very helpful.
Secretary Raffensperger, your thoughts?
We had a very active program with Secure the Vote. We'll be doing the same thing in 2022. The challenge we really had this year is that it was a tidal wave of misinformation. No matter how active and proactive you are, it's just tough to really, to get your message out. And then also you can have the facts, and sometimes people don't want to be confused with the facts because they're so wedded to the idea. And that's the challenge that you face. But we'll do the same thing in 2022. We also think that whatever we can provide information to NASS to help build, a stronger, robust campaign for all of us, because this looks like this may be the way elections are going forward. And we do live in polarized times, and elections are a flashpoint for that.
Thank you. And I know in creating this workshop today, there was a discussion about also talking about civics education and the need to have that championed more. Because as Secretary Raffensperger, I agree with you. I think we don't want this to become the new normal, and it shouldn't, and it doesn't have to, but it does require citizens as well as election administrators across the board working together to anticipate, educate, and empower each other to stand up and prevent the dissemination of false information and hold accountable those who disseminate it in violation of the law. And so for our next workshop, likely for the summer NASS meeting, we will likely have a conversation about that proactive education, about civics education. And Secretary Merrill, I welcome your suggestion idea. We can talk about it more tomorrow about having a standing committee or a new committee on voter education and ways and innovative ways that we can
Thanks.
Bring that forward. So I'm sure we'll enjoy discussing that as a organization moving forward. Secretary Ardoin, you had your hand raised. Did you want to have? No, pass. Okay. Well, with that, Secretary LaRose, I know we're at our time. We appreciate all of you today hearing our experiences. Please continue to ask questions because these were very challenging times that we've all endured. But I'm grateful for the collegiality of this organization and all of us working together to continue to share experiences, support each other, and learn from each other. Because as the Lieutenant Governor of Alaska said on a previous conversation that really meant a lot to me, was that any of us could have endured what many of us did endure this past cycle. And so I think we all have a responsibility to learn from each other, to share what we've learned and experienced, and protect and support each other as we continue to walk through fires together in our work to administer democracy. So with that, Secretary.
Well said. Yeah, no, well said, Secretary Benson. Let's wrap it up, everybody. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yep.
Appreciate you joining us today.